Minute or two before we get started, I didn't realize there wasn't a computer in this room, so my colleague is going to get mine so I can look it up. But I have a couple of things to pass around. One is a sign-in sheet. If anybody is coming as an extra credit for the class or something like that. Also, we just like to have a record of who's been, so if you wouldn't mind providing that information. And then I have a brief handout listing the topics for our other workshops this semester and some other information here for you to have, and I hope I have enough. If I don't, I'll probably get some more copies. My name is John Brocato, and I'm the coordinator of the Shackles Technical Communication Program. I'd like to welcome you to our first workshop this semester. And it's two parts. Initially, we're just going to talk about technical communication and how it operates within the field of engineering. For some of you, that may be repeat information, so you may have heard that before. For others, it may be brand new. And then we're going to move into talking about punctuation. And as I've said about the handouts that I've passed around, we have a series of workshops this semester, every other Tuesday from 3:30 to 5, and covering a variety of topics. And the first one that we're going to cover today involves some matters of punctuation. So mostly today is just me kind of talking about some issues, and if at any time you have any questions about any of it, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt and ask me your question. So we'll start now with our engineering communication overview. Purpose, audience, and style. Very simple concepts. Purpose is to the what or the why of your communication. Audience is who, and the style is how you go about executing that. So what do you communicate from within your field? And obviously this is going to vary tremendously based on whether you're undergraduate, graduate, postdoc, what field you're actually in, what your job itself entails if you're at that level. But it can range from ideas and procedures to data to correspondence. There's really all manner of things that engineers communicate. And so a word that we'll come back to quite a bit is adaptable. You have to be very adaptable about the kind of information that you create. And one of the mistaken impressions some people have when they approach this subject is that it's very, I think maybe because these same people tend to think of engineering or science as very cut and dried, that engineering communication is very cut and dried. That there's one way to write this kind of document, there's one way to write this kind of document, one way to do this kind of presentation, and that's really inexact. There are many, many ways to go about a lot of these different type of things, and so you always have to keep your audience as your foremost concern. Beyond the what, we can talk about why, that purpose. Why do engineers communicate? And although there are certainly more modes than these two, basically they fall into the camps of to inform and to persuade, to convey information to an audience either for their own personal benefit or to by request because they've asked you to provide that information, or to persuade, to try to get them to take steps to do something, like to give you money for a research project or something like that. And of course, these aren't distinct. These purposes do often overlap. That is how we think about how we frame this kind of information, how we build the information for our audience. With whom do you communicate? And of course, depending on the job that you're in and the type of work that you're doing, this also may vary greatly, but it can go all the way from lay people or the general public, people who literally have no concept of the basics of the work that you're doing, certainly not any kind of scientific basis for it, all the way up to experts, executives, bosses, clients, government officials, legal personnel. So it can be a wide variety of audiences, and sometimes an audience filled with all those people together, which makes it even more challenging when you have to explain something from the ground up for non-experts, but you also have experts who maybe don't need all of that. So it can be very tricky to discuss this. Now, one concept I want to try to make plain is the words involved in what we're doing, and we'll leave it with writing for right now. a lot of times when people hear technical writing or technical communication, either one, they kind of get these words mixed up in terms of what applies to what. The technical in this phrase refers to the content. So we're all here talking about technical fields and technical subject matter. Topics that lay people who aren't involved in engineering and the sciences may not know very much of. But this word does not really apply to the writing. It really has more to do with the content of the subject. The writing, we want to be simple, so just the opposite of technical, and also accurate. And simple refers to the style. That's really what we're talking about there, is the style of how we're communicating. So the style shouldn't matter much in terms of who the audience is. You always want to have the simplest, most accurate style. And in English, a lot of times you'll hear these words put together as synonyms for one another, but they're actually not. Simple versus simplistic. You've heard simplistic before as a version of simple. Simplistic actually means watered down. So you can think of it as thermodynamics for fourth graders, for example. Okay? That's not what we're talking about when we talk about simple. We're considering that our readers, even as lay readers, probably are going to be college educated, or at least smart enough to comprehend, more than basic concepts. It's just that they have no training in, for example, thermodynamics or soil mechanics or programming languages or whatever our field actually happens to be. So that, even as we look at all these various types of audiences, this is still what we keep in mind. Although the content itself is what's technical, the writing, we want to be as simple as possible while still being accurate with it. We don't want to water it down. We want to make sure we include as many details as we can. So why worry about these different types of audiences? That's because, first of all, the audience determines everything about what we do. Okay? Everything we write, everything we put together in this type of scenario revolves around the audience. And because we have shifting audiences, they have different wants, they have different needs, they have different expectations, and they have different knowledge bases. So you can't approach it by saying, this is the one way that I write, and this is going to be what it's like no matter what. We have to be adaptable. So how you communicate has to be adaptable. You have to be able to look and see, this audience may want this audience may want this, or they may have a different need or something. Hopefully they've communicated that to you. So that's why we focus so much on shifting audiences and making sure that we can cover that appropriately. So the other thing is that audiences also are important for a few different reasons. One is that audiences judge you by the words you use. And if that sounds negative, I don't necessarily mean it to be so, although it certainly can be negative. But how you communicate says an awful lot about how an audience, the impression the audience has of you as a professional. And that's why you hear people stress communication skills so often, whether it's your major professor, your advisor, or people in your department, or anything like that. It's that people form a basis or form a judgment about you as a professional based on how you communicate in one way or another. So what you write and what you present is tremendously important. An extension of that is that audiences can also give you what you want, whether it's a job, whether it's research funding, whether it's both of those things, whatever. So a lot of times we're in that, so I talked about the two different reasons, to inform and to persuade. Here we'd be in the persuasive side of things. You're writing to somebody, for example, or giving a presentation, trying to get them to give you something, whether it's a job, whether it's research funding. And so your communication, to a great extent, is going to determine whether that's successful or not. So in our program, what we talk about is that your communication creates your professional persona. The persona is sort of like your personality as perceived by other people. So how people perceive you as a professional in your work environment. Your communication, I would argue, is the strongest contributor to that. How you write, how you present, makes up that professional persona for others. It's similar to when somebody goes into a job interview. If you've ever sat on the other side of the table from a job interview, so you're doing the interviewing, and you're going to hire somebody, you're going to select somebody for some particular thing. You may even know that the person is very qualified for the job, but they get in there in the interview, for example, and they just don't handle themselves very well. They get tongue-tied, they don't speak all that well, they don't give very detailed answers. That usually tends not to go well for that person, even if they're qualified in that interview when they can't communicate that to the people face to face. A lot of times that doesn't go well for them. On the writing side, a poorly written job application letter, for example, is a terrible foot forward many times, because people see that and they think either that the person is not educated enough with language to write a coherent letter, or they're careless. And the question really becomes, which one of those is worse? And for me, it's the carelessness side of things. And if somebody can't be careful enough to make sure that their letter casts them in the best possible light, that doesn't look good very often. So it's very important that any type of communication you engage in always casts you in the best light possible and gives others a good impression of you. So let's talk a little bit about what we know about readers and how we should respond. So here's what we know. Readers are impatient. Readers in professional settings are different from readers who may be, excuse me, simply reading for pleasure. They want what they want, okay? And obviously that's going to vary, but a lot of times it's helpful to think of that as the bottom line. They want to know how much something's going to cost, or if it's a yes or no decision, or if it's a delivery of bad news somehow that you're delivering that bad news. But it's always to your advantage as a writer to get to the point immediately. Don't waste anybody's time. If you think about an abstract for a technical report, in many ways an abstract exists for this very reason, because it gives readers an opportunity to see the main points early without having to read everything else. Now they may still go read everything else, but they can get and however long an abstract is, they vary, 7 to 10 sentences, something like that, that says all the main points. Or in a business letter that starts out saying, I am writing to inform you that blank. So in the first sentence, you automatically get that purpose right there. For me as a reader, that's always a good sign when a letter starts out that way, because then what the sense I get is that the writer is not wasting my time. They want me to know immediately, here's what we're going to get into. When somebody starts a different way, after about 3 sentences, I kind of wonder where they're going, and I do what most people do, which is skip to the bottom to look for clues. You know, like, I regret to inform you, or unfortunately, or some element of bad news like that, but I wonder how much it is. A lot of times in this scenario, what happens is when people are asking for money, even in high profile, high stakes situations, people are nervous about asking for money. Why? Because they're just nervous about asking for money. It's a nerve-wracking type of situation. And I've served on proposal committees where at the end of the proposal, we didn't know how much money they wanted. And that's not good. Because we have a budget to work from, and so we're awarding so many grants based on however many people applied and how much, the pot of money that we have. And so we're doing the math all along, trying to figure out, okay, well, here's how much we have and here's how much we can award. And we get to the end of one, and we're like, we don't know how much they want. That's not a good thing. And a lot of times what happens is they're not, it's what we, just very generically would term a lot of money. So they're nervous about asking for it. And so they don't really give you one lump sum. As a reader, I would rather see that up front, $14 million right there up front, even if that's ridiculous somehow. At least we know, we don't have to worry about, and outside of engineering, you'll see this, for example, if you get letters or emails from companies with whom you do business, if they're raising your rates, insurance company, Netflix, TV company, that sort of thing, very rarely do they get to the point immediately. They usually, and the term is beat around the bush. They, here at DirecTV, we value your, that's never a good sign. When it starts out that way, that usually means what they're heading toward is to say, unfortunately, the cost of doing business has gone up, all these reasons, and so they eventually indicate, and what's funny is a lot of times they don't say your rates are going up. It'll say something like, new pricing will be applied as of such and such a date, which if you take that literally, could mean I'm not going to pay as much. Of course, that never happens. It's always, it always goes up. But that's the opposite of what we want to do. We want to be as clear as possible up front. Also, because this one here, I'll skip to it for a second. But readers skim. Readers are not necessarily going to read in a linear fashion from beginning to end. They may skip around to find the information that they're most interested in. You may still have to include all of that, and we'll get to design in just a second, but that's also one of the reasons why you want to get to the point immediately, so they just know. It's a good idea to just treat all of your readers, and I mean all of them, as extremely busy people who don't want their time wasted. And a lot of times that will really help get the communication across. Now that doesn't mean, it may still mean that your article is 30 pages long, or that your thesis is 80 pages long. But you still want to put the most important points up front so that they see that up front first, and then they get to the rest of the detail later. Readers are also easily distracted. So if you put in things that are not the main point, that they may start thinking, well, I thought this was about this, or maybe it's going to be this over here. You don't want to do that. Keep everything simple but accurate. Don't let them get distracted. So on the concept of reader skimming, and a lot of you already know this certainly, headings are tremendously important. That's one of the great benefits of this kind of communication, as opposed to, the humanities, for example, where a lot of times it's just paragraphs. And that's not really a bad thing necessarily, but it's sort of how it's read there. Here, you almost want to think about readers as users of information instead of just readers to sit down and read from beginning to end. They're going to jump around and read the parts that are important to them. And when you have headings, that helps. It shows organization to your readers. It gives them a sense of where it's going. It helps guide them as they read. In shorter documents, it almost works like a table of contents, except not in a list at the beginning. But if somebody skims through the headings, then they get a sense of where it goes. Headings can also help your own writing process. I use them on my own for conference papers, for example, as an outline, really. Just here are the headings I think I'm going to have, and it gives me a sense of where it's going to go. And of course, I'll modify those as I'm working on it. But it's for me, it's better, and people are going to do it different ways, but for me, it's better than just start writing, just put in words, and I've just got this blob of information that I've then got to go back and figure out where I want to put it. I'd rather start with kind of a framework. On that same note, you want to be informative. Write informative headings that anticipate and give away information. So instead of just background, which certainly conveys some information, background on dielectrophoresis of cells, however, is much, 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 much more specific. And that, along with simplicity, that word alone tends to solve a lot of our problems. Specificity, being specific, providing details. Many times that will solve a lot of the problems that we have because we're writing too general. And in talking with students a lot of times, one of their concerns is, well, I don't know how detailed I should be. And what I try to get them to do is lean toward being, if you're not sure, be more detailed. Don't, and it seems like a lot of times they go the other way. They say, well, I'm not sure how much detail you want, so I figured I would just keep it general. No. Do the opposite. Provide more. And see, that's one of the reasons headings help, is that even if you have a lot of information that maybe your reader eventually won't use, with headings they don't have to read it. If you have a report that covers a lot of background and history and context before it gets into maybe a lit review, methodology, results and discussion of results and so forth, and so you have expert readers who don't need the background and the history, if you have headings, they just skip that. They look at those and they go, well, I don't need that. All they want to see is the methods or the results. They don't have to worry about it. If it's all one paragraph, or just all one continuous document with no breaks, they have a much harder time doing it. So for example, this is my syllabus, and this is how it really looks. This one is stripped of all identifying information, which makes it pretty clear, not that a syllabus is terribly exciting anyway, but this is obviously a lot easier to use because it gives you a sense of where things are. You have stuff in bold, you have some boxes, you have lists, some things that are highlighted, that sort of stuff. This is just text. You have no choice with this but to sit there and read it. That's it. This you can use. You can actually move around. And I do this every semester when I get my syllabus out. I've been teaching for 18 years. I have never handed out a syllabus and somebody started reading on the first line and read all the way through. Nobody ever does that. They get the syllabus and they look through it. They skim, which is one of the reasons I set it up the way I do, so that when they skim, they can see all these different types of information. Maybe they're just looking for the schedule at the end to see when assignments are due and so forth. But that's how we approach this in this kind of writing. We think of it visually so that readers can actually use the information. And of course, sometimes you'll have formats that are very, very rigid. NSF, for example, is very famous for having formats that are absolutely, you can't vary from them at all. You know, if it's 15 pages limit and you write 15 and a half, they'll just reject it because it's too long, because that's the way they want it to be. In other scenarios, you have a lot of choice in the matter, so that's going to vary a whole lot. But what you want to think about is visually, how much information am I giving my readers at any given time? A couple of other ideas here. Readers interpret. Language is not a one-to-one relationship. The things we say can often be taken in multiple ways. And part of what we have to do as communicators is work to eliminate options in meaning or intent. One that I was talking about with my class earlier today is the word cheap, or in the other forms, cheaper or cheapest, when we're talking about money. Why is that a problem? What's one of the problems with using this word when you're talking about money?
I don't know. It's subjective to that person.
Okay, it's definitely subjective. We have cheap, maybe. I tend to be kind of a cheapskate. So cheap to me means, you know, like a nickel. I try not to spend a lot of money. But it may be $10,000 instead of 10 million. We don't know. So yes, it's very relative. What else?
I think of low quality.
Yes, that's it. Exactly. This has, inescapably, it has two meanings. Cheap means low cost, but it can also mean low quality or poor quality. And even if you don't intend low quality or poor quality, that's what your reader may hear. And that's bad. We don't want, if you don't mean poor quality, don't say this. We should go with this option because it's cheaper. That's a little bit dangerous because that can mean two things. Less expensive has nothing to do with quality by itself. That just means money, period. So that's an example of that, of finding a place where we have some options in meaning. Maybe go with this one because that removes all doubt. We're not talking about, now it may be that what's less expensive is of lower quality, but it doesn't say that by itself. But cheap has more than one meaning. So that's where we may run into some problems. And that there are other phrases like that, but any other time when we do that sort of thing, you want to try to eliminate those options in meaning or intent. And then lastly, readers expect convention in grammar and style. Now, those of us in our program, for those of you that don't know, are all English writing teachers, humanities people. None of us are engineers by training. But we work in the College of Engineering. Now, English teachers tend to get a rap as being what's known as grammar Nazis. So they are very particular about the rules of grammar, the rules of English, and following this rule and following that rule. That's all well and good. In this field, though, and this is why I phrased it this way, this is more the issue. It's not so much about following rules as it is about reader expectation. And so it goes back to that professional persona. If you submit something that is full of errors, the problem is not so much that you don't know the rules of English, but the reader looks at that and thinks, what? This person is not very intelligent. Or this person is very careless. And both of those are really bad. So learning these rules or learning to follow these conventions in grammar and style is really more about what your readers expect, not so much about these are the rules and you must follow them. And the only thing you can do about that really is just to proofread again and again and again. There's really no way around it. You have to get your writing looked at by you and by others if you can do it, so that you can weed out those types of problems as they come up. So as far as style, then, and this will repeat some of what we've already said, what style works best? You want to be direct, you want to be detailed, and you want to be simple. And if you notice some of these ideas, if they're not quite contradictory, they sort of work against one another. Being simple versus being detailed, for example. When you add detail, it tends to make it more complex. And all that, it's not contradictory, all that means is it takes work. In order to add detail and keep it from getting overcomplicated, you have to work at it, to structure it in such a way that it doesn't become very difficult. So again, going back to get to the point immediately, say exactly what you mean early and clearly. detailed, provide enough specifics for a thorough understanding. Think of yourself as a resource for your readers. If you can quickly define something for them or quickly provide some details for them and keep them from having to look it up elsewhere, go ahead and do it. Okay? Because they're going to look at you in many cases as the expert on that subject, and who better for them to get that information from than an expert? Obviously, expert depends on how much you know about the subject and where you are in your career, but basically that's going to be the case, especially for non-expert readers. And then again, going back to simple, be purposeful with wording and structure while still retaining accuracy, clarity, and professionalism, accuracy being the most important point. No matter how simple it is, you still want it to be accurate. Again, we're not talking about simplistic, watering it down, making something palatable for kids, for example. Keeping it from being too complicated in the way that we say it. Definite and forceful. Okay? One of the struggles with this kind of language and this kind of communication is that we tend to lean toward weak language for one reason or another. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that although a lot of times people talk about behavior skill, communication skills. That's the common phrase. And that's not necessarily wrong, but communication is really more of a behavior. It's something that we've been doing, ever since we were beings on this earth in all kinds of ways. And the older we get, the more complex it gets. But that means, because it's a behavior, that it's also characterized by habits. And some of those habits are bad. We fall into habits out of ease. We're very efficient beings. Another way of saying that is that we can be very lazy. We figure out shortcuts to do things, which I try to think of as efficiency, but a lot of times it may just be lazy. And with communication, the same thing happens. And so a lot of times the language we use on a regular basis outside of professional communication, while it's fine for day-to-day communication, may not work what we're trying to do. Again, specific language. Compare. The results fall well within reason. I can't tell you in the years I've been in engineering how many times I've read a statement like that about somebody's results. The results fall well within reason. And my suspicion has always been that even experts who really know about that field, because usually I'm reading it as an editor. I don't know anything about that field, but I'm looking at it for the writing and trying to make it better. But my suspicion is that even a professor in Simrall who's an expert in that looks at that and probably goes, what does it mean? Does it mean it's within reason? And that's that person. For me, I don't have a clue what that means. I have no idea if there's a number that you can ascribe that to, or that reasonable means today's a Tuesday and so it's reasonable. Tomorrow it's a Wednesday, it might not be reasonable tomorrow. I have no idea what that means. So as communicators, we want to take the initiative to say that. So instead of that, say something like, results fall within 10% of those reported previously by Smith. And we actually even give it a citation, the year and the name, and we have it within a 10%. That's just one example. It could take any of a number of other forms. But like the gentleman back here said a little while ago about cheap and it being subjective and relative. I have some former students in here, so I'm not knocking undergraduates in mass, but that's who I teach, and it tends to happen with them where we talk about this, and we talk about this, and we talk about this, and they turn in their writing, and they say, a project like this costs a tremendous amount of money. And they leave it at that. And I just think, you're robbing me of the opportunity to know how much this costs, because a tremendous amount of money to me is like $500, and because that's just how I am with money. But my guess is that public works project, they're probably not talking about $500, it's probably and here we go, millions, tens of millions, whatever. You're the person who can tell us that, even if it's a range, and it may be a big range. But the less expert your readers are, the less of an idea they'll have about this kind of thing. So do the work, make your job hard to make your reader's job easy. That's part of what you do in this kind of communication, is do the work to provide them the information, because they may not even be able to provide it for themselves. And in this day and age, a lot of people say, oh, well, they could Google it and find out. Yeah, but you're better than Google. If they're reading you on a particular subject and you have some level of expertise on that subject, then I would much rather hear it from you than go Google it and say, well, Wikipedia said blah, blah, blah. I would rather Garrett tell me. I'd rather find that out from him and know, okay, all right, Garrett said it, I believe it, that's good. He's an expert on X, Y, Z, whatever that subject is. So revision, and I'm just touching on this briefly because some of our later workshops this semester we're actually going to do some of this. But there's some very simple things that you can do when you revise that are tremendously helpful. One is to revise forms of be whenever possible, the verb to be. And just so we're clear, because verbs in English are just insane. They make absolutely no sense whatsoever, even to those of us who speak them. Is, are, were, be, been, etc. All those different versions. Why is revising be helpful? What does that accomplish? There's a very nice logic to this. The verb is the action part of the sentence. That's where the action of the sentence actually takes place. How much action comes from a be verb? None. Be there's no action. It's the least action possible. You just exist. It's just sitting there, not doing anything. Whereas other verbs, even something like do, moves a little bit, but conducted, extrapolated, attacked, all these have movement. They actually have motion. And what happens, and we'll do this in another workshop, usually when you have a verb of being, that means the action of the sentence is somewhere else in the sentence. So it's not in a verb spot, it's somewhere else, and it's not doing the action of the sentence. So what you do is you liberate the action from that other part and put it into the sentence. And that's, if you took a piece of writing and removed all the be verbs from it and put actual good active verbs in there, it would improve your writing a tremendous amount immediately. Because all of a sudden, every verb you have is very active. It's actually doing something instead of a weak verb that's just sitting there. Now, do you need be verbs sometimes? Absolutely, no question. But out of habit, we tend to fall back on them too much. 2 is to revise for sentence variety. One of the, again, most important strategies for revising, almost a secret, if you will, about readers, is all readers like and want and need sentence variety. And what I mean by sentence variety is a combination of shorter and longer sentences. And there's no magic number. It would be great if we could say, for every 2 short sentences, have a longer one, and everything's fine. It doesn't work that way. But you know it when you see it. Somebody that writes in very, very short sentences, it's almost like a car that can't get out of second gear. It tries to go and then it stops and it hesitates and you don't have any rhythm or flow to it. And the opposite side is equally true. So if somebody writes in nothing but very long sentences, it's exhausting. You can't follow them. You'll be in the middle of a sentence and you've forgotten what the beginning of it said because it's so long. So as we write and revise, we want to make sure that we go back and look for that we look and see relatively how long our sentences are and how we can change those up. And again, we're going to work on that specifically in a later workshop. And then another one, much like be, is to lessen the number of prepositions, phrases with of, for, and to in them. The problem with those are not that they're bad by themselves, quite the opposite, but that as our sentences grow in complexity and we add ideas, the way we usually add ideas are with prepositional phrases. And so what you'll have is a sentence with a tremendous string of prepositional one after the other. And if you read it out loud, you can hear it. It just sounds absolutely ridiculous. You have to go back and revise that and lessen the number of those. Those 3 things make a tremendous difference in your writing when you go back and proofread. But one of the problems with that is saving time to do that. And that's really the crux of a lot of this, is that people almost en masse, everyone, whether they really love writing or not, tends to put off writing as long as they possibly can. They just put it off and they put it off and they put it off because they don't like writing, they don't think they're any good at it. Sometimes it's legitimate. You're waiting on test results to come back, you're waiting on a study to be finished, so you can't really do the writing until it comes back. But a lot of times, especially students, and again, I teach mainly undergraduates, so that tends to be the way it happens. They don't save themselves time to proofread. And they don't take time away from what they've written to see what it really, to see what it really looks like. So it takes some time to do this. You have to get in the habit. Again, we're talking about behavior and habits. And so you have to get in the habit of doing that. Quickly too, we won't really get into this too much this semester, but just to make sure that I touch on it. Professional ethics is another angle of technical communication, both on the documentation side. The professional activities, especially those that involve public safety, have to withstand scrutiny. That is, they have to be able to tell their readers that the engineers involved, the scientists involved, were thinking about public safety, and that this reflection, in other words, the documents reflected well on writers and those writers' organizations. Now, another angle to this is plagiarism, and we have to bring this up to make sure everybody's clear about what this is when we're writing. So plagiarism, you can define this a few different ways, all relatively similar. Using someone else's work as your own, using source material inappropriately, paraphrasing inappropriately, you think you've paraphrased appropriately, but you haven't. Or, and this is a variation of this one, using source material in your work without giving proper credit. Okay? And what we're talking about are ideas attributable to somebody else. So you can say this idea came from this person or this group of people. Or exact wording. If you quote something directly, very often, that has to be cited. And this too, citing and so forth, we'll actually work on later in the semester as well. So how do you know if you need to cite? Cite if the material comes from a specific author or organization. Just talk about that. 2, the material you use is phrased very similarly to the original passage. Now notice that that's kind of slippery. It's phrased very similarly. How do you know? That depends. If you're in a situation where you can use turn it in, most of you are familiar with turn it in probably? Show of hands. Familiar with what turn it in is? Yeah. So turn it in can give you a percentage of how similar what you wrote is to everything turn it in measures against. And that's something that can help for sure. And then lastly, if the material you use is quoted directly. If you quote something directly, that obviously has to be cited because it's coming from somewhere else. There are some minor exceptions to that, but we'll get into that later in the semester in another workshop. When in doubt, two options here. One, ask an authority. And without bragging, I would say myself and my colleagues in our program are authorities on this, so you could always ask us and we'll give you our opinion. Or cite anyway, because citing something that doesn't need to be cited is much, much, much less of a problem than not citing something that really should be cited, because you can get in a lot of trouble for that, even if you're doing what you think is innocently. So, for those of you that don't know, penalties for plagiarism are extremely serious. In academia, it can go all the way from an F or a 0 on the offending assignment, which is honestly is a very, very mild penalty, to an F in a course. Now, at MSU, an F for plagiarism is an XF, and an X means the F was earned by academic misconduct. And that is usually the default penalty. When plagiarism occurs and it's been proven, the student's been proven responsible, this is usually the penalty that they get. The student can do some work to remove that X, but they cannot remove the F. The F stays there forever. And that's for a first offense. Second offenses and beyond are almost always suspension or expulsion from the university. And I will tell you that for graduate students, sometimes it starts here, because graduate students, their work is often so research intensive that it's just sort of held to a higher standard by the university. I'm on the Honor Code Council for the university, so I'm one of the people that conducts hearings for students who are accused of academic misconduct. And I've been doing that for almost 10 years, so I've seen many, 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 many cases of plagiarism. And they usually do not end very well for the student at all. It can also lead to loss of degrees, depending on how serious it is and what writings are involved. In the workplace, I've read documented case studies of plagiarism resulting in demotion or loss of job rank, people actually just getting fired because of promotion, also loss of degrees, and legal action. And it's this one here that, as bad as the penalties are in academia, in a school setting, to me they're actually worse in the workplace, because at that point you're dealing with copyrighted material, intellectual property, and like so much else in human life, when somebody stands to lose money at something, that's when they get really interested in it all of a sudden. So if something's being used inappropriately in the workplace, and there's this sense that maybe that's taking profits from the organization of the company, a lot of times, again, that does not end very well for the person involved. So all of that to say, very important for you to understand what the rules are and make sure that you're citing appropriately. And again, we have a workshop later in the semester devoted entirely to that. A few other important issues before we move on to punctuation. All communication is a feedback loop, and I really can't stress that enough. Too many times people treat communication as a finite occurrence, A to Z. I started here and I wrote, I got to Z, I'm finished with it, period, forever. If you went and got an old report that you written, or an old article that you had published, turned in a class, and you're finished with it 2 years ago, and you sat down and looked at it right now, you would find a multitude of things that needed fixing. Not even errors, really. Just, you would see new ways of looking at it all of a sudden. That happens to me all the time. When I write an abstract for a conference to see if the paper gets accepted, you know, it's usually a month, 6 weeks, something like that when I hear back from them. And so later, after I hear that they've accepted the abstract, hopefully, when I dig the abstract back out and look at it, I don't really remember writing it, to be honest with you. And that's a good thing, because at that point, I'm not emotionally attached to it. I'll look at it and go, well, that was really dumb. I need to do this instead, or move it around or something. But too many times we do the proofreading right after we finish writing, when we're in love with it. We think it's the greatest thing in the world. It's not, but we think it is because it's right there. That's why taking that time away is so important, because then you'll really look, and it's the same reason people get other people to look at it, because they think, well, they're not emotionally attached to it, so they'll give me honest feedback. Unfortunately, a lot of times you do that and the person doesn't pay a lot of attention to it, and they go, oh, it was great. Come on. It's never great. They should have. If somebody does that to you, they either didn't read it or they're lying. Okay? Surely they would have found something, even if it was fairly minor. So at some point, you have to unleash your writing on an audience, or unleash your presentation on an audience, and see what works. So you hear back from them. They say, well, I like this. This made sense. This didn't make sense. You should redo this, that sort of thing. And then you go back and do it again. Okay? And that's one of the difficult things about communication, is that it's, in a sense, it almost never ends. It just keeps going. Along those same lines, most of what we discuss as far as writing and speaking problems tend to stem from carelessness. It's not a matter of not knowing it at all. It's that we've put it off until it's too late, or maybe legitimately we were so busy we just kind of had to throw it together at the last minute and we didn't spend the time looking at it that we needed to. But that's, 95% of the problems I find in my students' writing stems from carelessness. It's not something they didn't know. They just didn't get around to doing it. Okay? So start early and be sure to proofread. And then lastly, as silly as it might sound, read your writing out loud to yourself. If it sounds awkward, it probably is. You see these things on Facebook that are a sentence or a paragraph with intentional misspellings, but you read it correctly anyway. That's kind of the sound of your own head. Like your voice inside your own head just kind of echoing around. It's not really what it sounds like. And then something happens with your own writing too. You'll just read it and you're not really hearing it for what it sounds like. But if you read it out loud, you will hear what it sounds like. And that, a lot of times that's when you'll stumble across things that simply don't work. I do that with almost everything I write, like for a conference presentation or a conference paper or something, because it helps me hear what, if something sounds awkward, if there's something that I have a hard time saying, a lot of times it's a sign that something's wrong with it at that point. Some other important issues: avoid first person in most writing situations. The more formal your writing situation is, the more true this will be, where you shouldn't use I or we or our. There are obviously exceptions to that. Correspondence is one. Sometimes it may even be allowable in some other types of situations. But there are still people who think that first person is something you shouldn't do in science or engineering writing. So it's a good idea to stay away from it. You is a little simpler. Stay away from you entirely, unless you're writing correspondence, or if you're literally writing an instruction manual in those situations, you are thinking of that you out there who's actually using the information you're providing. Stay away from contractions entirely. They're not wrong necessarily. They're just kind of seen as too informal. So get in the habit of staying away from those. A couple of resources for you to use: Purdue's Online Writing Lab, or OWL, and that link is on the handout that I gave you. The OWL is a tremendous resource. It has just an unbelievable amount of information on all kinds of writing. It has an entire section of their website on writing and engineering. Very, very helpful. We also have writing tutors that work in 202 upstairs. We have one right now. I'm in the process of trying to hire another one. They keep numerous office hours during the week, and I put some of those hours on that handout. They are there to provide feedback on engineering student writing, undergraduate, graduate, anything from class assignments to job application materials, theses, dissertations, that sort of thing. So you can see them during office hours, or you can contact them at this email address and work with them that way. But that's what they're there for. Lastly, a quote from Robert Louis Stevenson: "Don't write merely to be understood, write so that you cannot possibly be misunderstood." Anybody know who Robert Louis Stevenson was? I know somebody does.
He was a writer.
He was a writer, yes. What did he write?
It's a collection of stories, but I can't remember.
He does have a collection of stories. He's probably most famous for Treasure Island. He wrote that. He wrote another novel called Kidnapped, which is similar to Treasure Island, kind of a pirate type story. He also wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if you ever heard of that. That's his story as well. This quote didn't come from any of those places. I think it came from a letter he wrote to somebody. But it's a very good encapsulation. It kind of goes back to I erased it now, but the cheap versus less expensive idea. It's not enough to work to the point that somebody understands you. You want to look at the ways that they might misunderstand it. Okay? And that, again, goes back to the idea of a feedback loop. Closing the exits. Be impossible to misunderstand. Try to make it so that what you're saying and how you mean what you're saying is exactly what your audience gets. That's the mindset we kind of want to have. In a silly way, sort of like this Far Side cartoon with the guy he's trying to say help, but he said health. So, sorry, I guess he just wants to stay. So that's all that's supposed to mean. All right, with that, let's talk about punctuation a little bit. I'm in no way going to try to cover all of the punctuation marks. These are the ones I'm going to focus on today: commas, semicolons, colons, hyphens with compound adjectives, and miscellaneous issues. There's a link on the handout that I gave you for our resource page. These slides will be available either later today or in the morning on that resource page, so you can actually access them yourself if you want to. Now, a few notes about this. One, not all punctuation rules are strict. Okay? Some are situational or open to interpretation. So some of what I'm going to tell you here is not so much a rule, you must do this or bad things will happen, but guidance. It's a good idea to get in the habit of doing this because it's what readers expect. But as with all things in language, it changes over time. So some of what I'm going to discuss now might not have been a rule 50 years ago. And 30 years from now, it might not be a rule at that point. So not all of them are black and white, in other words. Some of it takes a little bit of interpretation. None of this is supposed to be an exercise in memory where you just know all the comma rules and so you don't have to worry about it. But you don't write in a vacuum. Use resources. If you have access to writing handbooks, these slides, the Purdue OWL, anything like that when you write, to look up information. Even though myself and my colleagues are authorities on this subject, it's something that we teach. I have my handbook and a dictionary and a couple of other things on my desk that I use all the time because I just want to look it up and make sure that I got it right. It's just a good habit to get into. Lastly, the rules that I'm going to discuss, or the guidelines I'm going to discuss, are based on American English, and I make that distinction because British English, as far as punctuation goes, can be very different. It's not absolutely identical. So if you're familiar with British English, for example, and you see some rules here that don't quite fit, that may be the explanation. So first, comma issue. Always provide a comma with two independent clauses and a conjunction. And I'm using the word always there. So here's the example. the liquid that is collected at the bottom of the column is piped to a heat exchanger, and some of the collected liquid is vaporized to re-enter the column so that the process can be repeated. All right, so what we have here is an independent clause, and another word for that is a complete sentence. I use a different phrase here. Complete sentence, a conjunction, and conjunctions can also include but and so. Actually, this is fun. Somebody showed me this when I was in grad school, and I thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever seen, but it turned out to be very useful. So the word fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, those are the main conjunctions, which again, when they showed it to me, I thought, that's so stupid. And here I am 18 years later, still using it because it's useful. So those are all the major conjunctions, and, but, and so are probably the most common, and here we're using and. So that's the conjunction, and then another complete sentence here. So the idea is when you have this part, and this part, you always want a comma there at the end of that first independent clause and just before the conjunction. So here's what it looks like fixed. You have the independent clause, comma, conjunction, and then the next one. The longer or more complex the sentence is, the more necessary this comma here is, because it gives the reader a signal that that's where the first main idea stops, and then the next one begins after that. With simpler sentences, it may not be as crucial, and that's what I say here. This is one of those rules that can be omitted without causing too many problems. In fact, you may read a lot of writing where they never ever do this. It's just something that they leave off. We suggest doing it because if you do it this way, it's never wrong, and it helps your readers out. It helps increase readability. So that's a good rule to get accustomed to. But all those conditions have to be present. Independent clause, conjunction, and another independent clause. So an exception to that would be this one. You don't include one when what comes after the conjunction is dependent. That is, it has no subject. The process of wastewater treatment is unfamiliar to many people, comma, but is essential to everyday life. Here you don't want that comma because this is not an independent clause. You see that? It's not a complete sentence what comes after that but. And if it said the process of wastewater treatment is unfamiliar to many people, comma, but it is essential to everyday life, then this would be an independent clause or a complete sentence, and we would want that comma there. As it is, we don't want this. We want it just to read straight through. And again, I try to think of this as practically as possible. If you put that comma there, does that make the sentence unreadable? No. You can still read it. You know what it says. But the standard, the convention, is not to put it there when this occurs. And so it's better to keep that straight if at all you possibly can. Independent clause, conjunction, independent clause, then you include the comma. When this is not independent, or when the first one is not independent. Well, no, never mind. Yes, never mind that. I got confused. When the second one is not independent, then you don't need that comma. All right. Always provide a comma between introductory independent clauses and main clauses. While flowing through the aeration basins, no conjunction, the water is stripped of carbon dioxide and other compounds. So what we have is a dependent clause, which is an incomplete sentence. So everybody sees this. This can't stand on its own as a sentence. While flowing through the aeration basins. There's no subject, no verb, really. And then this one is the main clause for the complete sentence. The water is stripped of carbon dioxide and other compounds. So you want a comma in between those. While flowing through the aeration basins, comma, the water is stripped of carbon dioxide and other compounds. So it's a different scenario than the previous scenario, but we still want this comma here to signal that this is the introductory clause. This is the main clause, so we're going to show where that main clause begins. Now, just like with the other issue, omitting that comma doesn't always create problems with reading. They may still read it just fine. But, A, it's never wrong, and there are some situations where it can prevent misreading, as in this one. did you do what I always do when I read this? To begin a geological survey must be, wait a minute, something happened. So you don't really know, and it's just a function of the way the sentence is put together. You don't really know if you're supposed to pause or read straight through here until you've already hit the verb and gone, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So do you pause or do you read straight through? Is that an enormous problem? No, not at all. But if you follow the rule, it wouldn't be a problem at all, because you know to begin, a geological survey must be taken to determine. And yes, of course, you could revise this entirely to avoid that. But this is legitimate. You can also fix it that way. So even in a situation like that, as short as it is, that comma can make a difference in readability. And again, it's about getting into the habit of doing this. If you're in the habit of following that rule, it'll probably make your sentences more readable. All right, always provide the terminal comma in a series of 3 or more items. The terminal comma, this is also called the Oxford comma, sometimes it's called that, comes just before the and in a series. It could be one of the other conjunctions, but it's usually and. Like this very simple sentence, I like green, brown, and orange. So this is the comma we're talking about, the terminal or Oxford comma. Omitting this can be harmless, just like the others, providing it is never wrong, and it can increase readability. So look at this example. The elbow system consists of a short section of aluminum tubing that attaches to a prosthetic hand, comma, a cog and wedge at the elbow joint, and another section of tubing that attaches to the shoulder. So if we're reading it correctly, we should have one here. And I still do, I've used this example for years, and I still have the issue where I read straight through without that comma. It's a little bit confusing.
Is this something new? Because I've had a professor that will omit it, and I've heard that you're supposed to have it, you're not supposed to have it.
It's not new, but there are people on both sides of it. So there are people who say, don't put it there. I got in an argument once with a guy, it's a faculty member in Semicolon actually, because he said the and performs the function of the comma. So if you have the and here, you don't need that comma, which I didn't agree with, period, because I was taught the opposite. But in a situation like this where you already have an and in it, it can really get confusing if you don't know which one is going where. So no, it's not a new one. Some people do not observe this rule. I think this is one of those that either does not exist in British English or it's something that's changed over time somehow. So no, it's not new, and I guess this would apply to all of these rules, or most of them. If you have a reader or a professor who says, well, that's just wrong, you should do it this way instead, you probably should listen to that person. Because they're the most immediate reader for you, and especially if they're going to be grading it or passing muster on your work, you're going to have to please them. You're going to have to please them instead. I stand behind this. I think this is the way it should be done. And the rationale is this, as I explain it here. So I have the simple sentence before about I like green, brown, and orange. Well, this one is a more complicated sentence, and I think that's more of a reason to actually put this here. Because you have that first item, a short section of aluminum tubing that attaches to a prosthetic hand. Compared to the others, it's relatively long. So the time is right here to show where that actually ends. And then you have the second one that has this and. And when you have multiple ands like that in that scenario, that can become confusing to readers. But if you have that here, that comma helps show this is number 1, this is number 2, and we have the and this is number 3. And it makes it clear. It's easier to read at that point. And that's 3 or more. So, I mean, there could be 6 different items. The point is the one before the and, before you get into that last item in the series, that's the place where that comma ought to go. Does that make sense to everybody? I know it's not. Punctuation is not clear or easy a lot of times anyway. That's the logic behind that. Now that's for 3 items and up. Do not provide one with only 2, okay? Roy's software proficiencies include SolidWorks, comma, and AutoCAD. That, as far as I'm aware, is never correct, okay? When it's 2, it's always just the and. You never have any commas in there. Never join two independent clauses with only a comma. This is the error we call a comma splice in English. Okay? They're considered to be major mechanical errors. They consist of the two independent clauses joined only with a comma, as we have here. At this 8-mile marker, the first of the final burns takes place. This is known as the terminal intercept, or TI, burn. So what we have is the two independent clauses. This first independent clause actually has a dependent clause attached to it, but it's still an independent clause on the whole. This one is an independent clause, and we have just the comma there by itself. Okay? That's an error. So we want to avoid that one. And the way we do that is either by putting a period or a semicolon. I chose a semicolon here. At this 8-mile marker, the first of the final burns takes place. Semicolon, this is known as the terminal intercept, or TI burn. You could put a period there, and that would be fine as well. Either one of those. But the comma is what you don't want. Yes?
Why not a colon? Why not?
We'll get to that in a second. The colon shows something else. We're going to talk about colon in a second, but it would not be correct here because of the relationship between this clause and this clause. That calls for the semicolon and the period. The colon would indicate something else. We'll get to that in just a second. A comma splice is still created if you use transition words like however or therefore. Consequently is another one, nevertheless. As in this example, exhaust systems do not create power, comma, however, a less restrictive exhaust can take away less power from the motor. That's still considered a comma splice. So like the other one, so here again, you have the two independent clauses, the transition word, and the comma. Like the other one, you could fix this with a semicolon or a period. Here I have to use the period. Exhaust systems do not create power, period. However, a less restrictive exhaust can take away less power from the motor. So you simply make it two sentences. It's one of the options that you can do for that. Before we move on to semicolons, any questions about commas? I know that doesn't cover all the comma rules, but those are some of the big ones. Yes?
What about subconjunctions, like when we use that and which? Because I had an English class that is in different.
Yes, that one can be a little bit tricky. And that's what's called restrictive clauses. And the simplest, let's see. I hope this makes sense. All right. The lawnmower that is in the garage is broken. The lawnmower which is in the garage is broken. Now, before I get into the comma here, I will say that many people nowadays use this interchangeably, so they don't bother using commas with those at all. So much so that in my student papers, I've almost stopped commenting on this because I have so many other things to comment on. I just decided this one I'm not going to worry about because I can't comment on everything. Nevertheless, this one is the one that takes commas. And the idea is that it's two separate meanings. So here, the lawnmower that is in the garage is broken. The sense in this sentence is that there's more than one lawnmower. So there's multiple, it's a house that has 3 lawnmowers. I don't know why you'd have 3 lawnmowers, but that's the example. This is an example from an old textbook we used, and I just never forgot it. I didn't make this up. So because you've got multiple ones, this is restrictive, and when it's restrictive, you use that and no commas. The lawnmower that is in the garage is broken, and what's implied is that there are other lawnmowers elsewhere. Presumably, they may or may not work. Okay. Now this one, you only have one. Which, used this way, is usually a signal that the information, in fact, this we call non-restrictive. It's almost trivia. That's probably too extreme. But it's just sort of additional information. A lawnmower, which by the way is in the garage, is broken. So one easy way to think of it, and that and which get used in different ways, so you can't really apply this all the time, but anytime you have a scenario like this, that never takes a comma, which typically always does. Is that fair to say? And I try never to phrase it that emphatically, because as sure as I do, somebody will say, well, what about this here? And it's an exception. And I go, okay, well, not that one. That's the one you don't do that. But typically in these scenarios, when it's that, there is no comma. When it's which, it is. And the idea, again, is that this is restrictive, this is non-restrictive. So this is identifying one out of several. Here, there's only one, and this is just additional information. Okay? That is in the garage is not just additional information. That's essential to understanding which one you're talking about. And that's where the comma doesn't go. Does that help? Does that make sense? Okay, let's move on to semicolons real quick. In written body text, semicolons are primarily used for two reasons. To join independent clauses that are closely related in some substantive or important way. Okay? The initial costs of such a system are high, often $800,000 or more than you have the semicolon. However, some companies have seen a full return on investment in fewer than 18 months. So the idea here is that this statement is related to this statement in some way. They have some sort of relationship. Could you put a period there instead of a semicolon? Absolutely, yes. So that's not a black and white rule necessarily about, in fact, I know people who think semicolons are just stupid. They just think, why do you ever need them? You don't need to use them for anything. And I, being, a grammar guy, well, that's not exactly true because blah, blah, blah. But really, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You kind of can do without it, but we don't. The other one is to separate three or more items in series, just like we did a second ago with commas. Here, you use that for items in a series that are relatively lengthy, or if they already contain commas. And this is not an ideal example, but it's pretty close. So the general equipment for this process includes one, a tank to hold the mixture, a pump to pump the mixture into the tank, a heater to heat the mixture to a boiling temperature, a distillation column to allow the travel of water vapor from the tank, a condenser to cool the water vapor so that it turns into a liquid, and a second tank to capture the liquid. I started out saying one, and I left off the numbers. I didn't even do that. But so you have all these items in series, and when you have many of them, or they're fairly long, or if they already contain commas, it's okay to separate these with semicolons, because that helps make it a little bit clearer. It's especially useful when they have commas. So just, and I should have gotten an example that had one, but just imagine that some of these had commas in them. So then you have commas that separated each item, and then you've got a comma within some of the items, and you don't really know which is which at that point. And that's when the semicolons are helpful, because it distinguishes one from the other. This is relatively rare, I would say, on the whole, to use it this way, but it is there. Those are probably the only two ways that you should use one. The field of scale model testing allows engineers to create safer, more advanced products more quickly and with less expense. Semicolon, a result which provides the consumer with a better product at a better price. This is not an independent clause right here, so you would not use a semicolon in between those two. Now, you may see some people who do that. Punctuation rules start to change over time, and they're very grassroots in the sense that they change over time because enough people, if enough of us tomorrow decided, we weren't going to have semicolons, we wouldn't have semicolons anymore because enough of us would have decided that. It's not handed down from on high. Here are your semicolon rules. It's based on what people decide to do. But typically, this is not done. Same thing here. Chemical composition refers to a breakdown of the substances in the stream. Semicolon, for instance, 10% water, 50% oxygen, 40% titanium. Yes? Right. So here you could use a comma, or a colon, or a dash. Probably a colon or a dash would be better because you've already got some commas in this sentence already. Here, you would probably want a colon or a dash for the same reasons. You've already got 3 commas, so you wouldn't want to just add to that. Colon or a dash would work better there. The amount of a substance that goes in a reactor, semicolon, must yield a product or products that equals that same amount. And I have to confess, this came from a student paper, and when I saw that, I was horrified because there's just absolutely no reason in the world that you would put that there. But my other reaction was, what a great example. So I immediately put it in a Word file. So here are examples of errors to show, not to make fun of anybody, but just here's a way that it was used where you wouldn't want to do it. So I have no idea what they were thinking, but you would never ever do that. This is a fairly common misuse. While every wing and airfoil shape has its own set of advantages and disadvantages, semicolon, the correct combination can be used with very effective results. That should just be a comma. That first one you would just want to omit, and you don't need anything there at all. It just shouldn't be there. So there's a very limited set of circumstances typically when you would use semicolons. On the colons, and we can identify 4 reasons why you typically use these. To introduce a list after an independent clause. This report discusses the following major points, colon, and then I won't read them all. We have A, B, C, and D. It's actually more than that, but I cut it off in the interest of space. And that's an important set of guidelines there. This needs to be an independent clause. You can't just put any old word in a colon and then a list after. You have to introduce it with an independent clause or a complete sentence. And not only that, you want it to be a complete thought. A lot of times people will say, this report discusses colon. That's not absolutely wrong per se, but it interrupts the flow of the sentence. So you really want this to be a complete thought instead of just chopping it off right after the verb. Let it be a complete thought and then use the colon. To introduce a quotation after an independent clause. Cheney suggests that laboratories should foster global teamwork, colon, and then you have the quotation here. So that's another way, if you're using quotations or introducing a quotation in some way, that's one of the ways that you can do that. 3, to introduce an example or further illustrate the point of an independent clause, and this is the example from a couple of slides ago with the colon in place, about the chemical composition of substances in a string. So here, instead, in that one it was a semicolon, here it would be a colon. That would be a legitimate use for that. And lastly, to emphasize the second of 2 independent clauses. The loss of Space Shuttle Challenger was hardly an accident, colon. Indeed, the very design flaw that caused this destruction had been openly and, in some cases, emphatically discussed for 8.5 years prior to the disaster. Okay. So here we have the 2 independent clauses, and the colon serves to emphasize. The colon is a firmer form of punctuation than the semicolon. It sort of draws more attention to it. So we're emphasizing this latter independent clause by saying that to drive home the point, so to speak. However, it's not all black and white. You could make a case that that could be a semicolon too. So it would depend on how you would interpret it. I would go with the colon there, but you can do either one of those. All right, so hyphens with compound adjectives. Anytime you have 2 or more adjectives that precede and modify a noun equally, they need to be hyphenated. And so here's a list of several that I just collected in various places. On-the-job injuries. And consider the importance of it being beforehand. If this was in a sentence, Jake acquired 7 on-the-job injuries. Okay? On the job is all working together really as one compound modifier for injuries, and that's why you hyphenate it. But if this was after, you wouldn't do that. Jake acquired 7 injuries on the job. On the job doesn't get hyphenated at that point because it's not working as one compound modifier. It's taking up another place in the sentence. So when it comes before, you do it that way. Flight critical components, and some of these you can see are fairly common constructions. Something critical components, you see that in all kinds of applications, and so that would work here. It's flight. Anything that's a quantity in a unit, 500 grit dry sandpaper, a very common one, 9-volt battery. Okay, those are both working together as one compound modifier for battery. Manufacturing related incidents, large scale software development. I couldn't believe it when I saw this one. I mean, it's almost ridiculous, it's so long, but it's just a great example of having to do this. 8 foot long, half credit card thick nozzle extension. Okay? And they punctuated it correctly. This gets hyphenated, but it still has the comma here because this is one compound modifier and this is one compound modifier, all hyphenated together like that. Air to fuel ratio, very common. Helicopter-like road, a 5-step process. Clay-filled tray, 45-degree sweat angle. Although omitting these may be harmless, like we've said about a lot of these other issues, you know, if you look back at these and take away any of those hyphens, you can ask the question, so if we take the hyphens out of any of these, do they still make sense? And the answer universally is yes, they do. So it's like a lot of these other rules. Omitting them may not necessarily cause any problem, but there are cases where it may become difficult. So here, a key distress mode used in analyzing turbine blade material performance and life is surface roughness. Turbine blade material performance, and that's, we get into noun strings like that, and lay readers like me have no idea what to do with it. So is it turbine blade together and then material performance? Is it turbine blade material performance? Or all three together, turbine blade material performance? And some people may look at that and say, well, you're reading too much into it, it's not important. Well, that's the question too. Are these all the same thing? Is this even important? If you handle that as the writer with this material, you let us know, we don't have to worry about it. You know, if you punctuate this in any way, I'm giving you the benefit that I'm gonna assume it's right. If Saracen puts that in there, I'm gonna think, Saracen's an expert in this, she knows what she's talking about, that's what it is, I'm not even gonna question it. If it's not there, then I know as a reader that all these words together may need to work in some combination to make sense, and I don't know what it is. So as the expert, so to speak, you want to take care of it. Another example, same type problem. Small network appliance platforms, such as routers, fall in this broad category. Small network appliance platforms, same issue. Okay? We can put those in different combinations. Is it small network appliance platforms, small network appliance platforms, small network appliance, all one platforms? And again, same question. If you look at that and you're like, it doesn't really make any difference. Lay readers don't know that. Help us out. You know, find which one is it? Which one is it? And again, it may not, if you're writing it, you may not know yourself when you look at it. So you may have to talk about it with somebody. When this comes up on student work, I'll often ask, which one is that? And we'll have like a 5-minute discussion about what they all mean, and they'll eventually go, oh yeah, it's number 2, that's what it should be. It took that discussion for us to get that, but now I understand it. Now other readers might understand it. Again, let your audience know what that is. So the idea here, along with a lot of the other ones, is leaving these punctuation marks out may not cause an issue, but you never know when you're going to run into a situation where it will become very confusing. So if you get in the habit of using them, you're always prepared. A couple of miscellaneous issues as we close out. If you're punctuating quotations, there's a certain order. One is last quote, and I'll show you an example of this on the next slide. Last quoted word, closing quotation mark, the citation, and then the period. That's the order that it goes in. Or, if you're not citing it, if it's a quotation but you're not citing it for some reason, last quoted word, period, closing quotation mark. So that period goes inside the quotation mark. And that's one I think that is different American versus British. I think in British they put that outside, we do not. So here's an example. According to Al McDonald, quotation, for each day the shuttle was out of flight status, it was costing NASA over $10 million or $4 billion a year. Final word, quotation mark, citation, period. So the citation rather is part of the sentence, but it's not part of the quotation. And the only thing that's in the quotation marks is quoted material, what actually shows up in the original. Clearly the citation is not going to show up in the original. If you have no citation, and this is one of those issues where English is just, there's not much of a rhyme or reason for it. It's just the way it is. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Without a citation, other punctuation marks appear outside the closing quotation mark unless they're part of the original quote. So a semicolon, a question mark, an exclamation point, colon, dash, any of those will be outside. Periods and commas are the only ones that go inside the quotation. Now many times at the end of a quotation it's going to be the end of a sentence, so it's just a period. Sometimes it could be in the middle, and you might have a comma and then continue the sentence after that. And that comma, if you have a citation, that would come after like the period does. But if you don't have the citation yet, then that would be here inside the quotation. I find that Microsoft Word sometimes points that out if I've made that mistake. Sometimes it does not, though. Good old Microsoft Word, you can't really count on it too much. Does that make sense to everybody? Last miscellaneous issue, if you have a vertical list, use periods when these vertical list items are complete sentences. If they're not complete sentences, don't use any punctuation at all. So if you read this, you see this report discusses the following major points, the history of NASA's space program. It's not a complete sentence. None of the rest of these are, so none of them have periods. If they were all complete sentences or independent clauses by themselves, then they would get a period at the end. So a quote question somebody might ask is, well, this one's a complete sentence, but these are not. What do we do then? And the answer is they all should be the same. So they all should be complete sentences, or none of them should be complete sentences in a vertical list. They all should be identical. That's what in English we call parallelism, which we'll also get into in a later workshop. I get that question fairly frequently, and that's how that's punctuated. You don't need any at all at the end if they're not complete sentences. All right, so that brings us to the end of punctuation, and we're just about on time. On February the 4th, we're going to talk about sentence structure, including agreement, parallelism, which I just mentioned, coordination and subordination, and we'll probably have more time then for some work in class, looking at sample sentences and kind of doing those together. As I said earlier, I'm going to put these slides up on this site probably tomorrow morning. I'll put them up so you can access them if you want. This is a catch-all email address right here. You can send us email if you need to, if you have questions about any of these things. Also, at the end of these slides, we didn't quite have time to get to them today, but I put some exercises in here based on some of what we talked about. And so, and most of them, I think there are one or two I might have made up, but the rest of them come from a link on the Purdue OWL. But, so it'll give you an example of something that needs punctuation, and then if you click on it in animation, the answer will pop up here. So you can kind of, if you're interested in testing yourself on any of this stuff, I think there's about 11 of them, 11 or 12, something like that. So you can go through and actually see if you know what the answer is. And then, so for this one, since we got a minute or two, let's just look at this one. What do we need here? Right, where? Right, after airlift. Yeah. So they'll pop up and show you the answer. And some of them are fairly simple. There are a couple that are a little bit sneaky. So might be worth looking at. And that link here, one of the great things about the OWL, in addition to all the information they talk about, they have exercises for almost every subject they discuss. You can go on the OWL and look at exercises, and they have links to give you the answer and so forth. You can kind of drill yourself on some of these issues if you need to. But as I said, at the end of this, which we didn't get to today, there are 11 or 12 exercises here that you can look at and look at the answers for if you think they'll help you. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you again in 2 weeks.